Secretary DeVos's harmful new borrower defense rule, I was glad it passed with bipartisan support. We are here today because the President has chosen to veto the resolution and stand with Secretary DeVos and unscrupulous institutions that cheated students. This is indefensible. We are in a challenging time for our country, but this should not be hard. Let's stand with the victims of deception, the students we represent across the country, not with unscrupulous institutions, not with Secretary DeVos, and not with Donald Trump. I urge my colleagues to join together and override this veto, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Rowe.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to the resolution. As a ranking member of the Committee on Veterans Affairs, I've heard a lot of misinformation about the Department of Education's borrower defense rule and its effects on student veterans. Here's the truth. The rule does not limit the rights or benefits provided for veterans in the GI Bill or service members who use the Department of Defense Tuition Assistance Program or the TAP program. Any veteran or service member who is defrauded by an institution and took out federal loans will have the opportunity to have that claim fairly adjudicated just like any other student would under the rule. When I was chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee in 2017, I authored the Forever GI Bill to make more veterans eligible to receive a GI Bill benefit and make veterans eligible to receive this valuable benefit for life. 45 years ago, this Army veteran, when he left the Army, used the GI Bill. I know how valuable it is personally, Mr. Speaker. It helped me and my family tremendously, and that's why we wanted to make this benefit a lifetime benefit. Just a few months ago, this Congress passed 2 bills to protect student veterans whose GI Bill benefits were impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. My record has shown that one of my top priorities is ensuring veterans can receive a quality education. And a large part of that is ensuring that they receive the education they were promised and holding schools accountable for fraud. The department's rule does just that. And it sets up a clear process for borrowers to have their claim adjudicated and hold institutions of all types accountable. This rule is fair to borrowers, it's fair to schools, it's fair to taxpayers. I support this rule, I support the President's veto, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, a member of the Committee on Education and Labor, but more importantly, chair of the full Committee on Veterans Affairs, because so many veterans have been implicated by fraud on these institutions. Gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I thank the chairman for yielding. So when the Trump administration and Secretary DeVos approved its new borrower defense to repayment rule late last year, it was clear that they had chosen to pander to the for-profit college industry and cheat thousands of borrowers out of the relief that they deserve. Predatory for-profit institutions consistently put their profits over students' education. They make false promises about job prospects, drain federal resources, and leave millions of students with useless degrees and high student loan debt. Yes, veterans are among that group of people, and that's why major veteran service organizations have come out in favor of this veto override and supported the original legislation. Veterans, women, and minorities are aggressively recruited by these institutions who only see them as a benefit to their bottom line. ITT Technical Institute, Corinthian Colleges, and Dream Center colleges are just some of the predatory for-profits whose lofty promises turn student dreams into a nightmare. The student borrowers who were defrauded by these schools are desperately seeking relief, but Secretary DeVos is making that task nearly impossible. And that is why this year both chambers of Congress passed a bipartisan Congressional Review Act resolution that rejected Secretary DeVos's harmful rule. Students, consumer advocates, and student veterans groups spoke out in favor of this CRA and urged President Trump to sign it into law. But the president refused to heed their call, choosing instead to uphold Secretary DeVos's watered-down rule that put additional burdens on borrowers. We must override the president's veto. Congress must again stand with student loan borrowers and stop the Trump administration's attack on America's students and his attempts to rig the rule in favor of Secretary DeVos's cronies. More than 200,000 student borrowers are still waiting for relief. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes from another wonderful gentleman on the committee from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the leading Republican member of the committee. I rise today, Mr. Speaker, in strong opposition to today's attempt to override the president's veto. I think all of us agree that it is important to offer borrowers a process to discharge loans when they have been defrauded by a school. And that's what the rule, crafted with significant stakeholder input, offers. And that was the original intent of the borrower defense process when it was enacted in 1995. However, in 2016, as we've heard, the Obama administration used this process to advance an ideological loan forgiveness scheme. And it worked as they intended. We went from fewer than 60 claims over 20 years to nearly 330,000 claims in 4 years, which would cost the hardworking taxpayers, if they had to pay this price, $40 billion, and they will have to pay that price. Now, I don't need to go into reasons why that 2016 Obama rule was flawed. Instead, I'll highlight some of the improvements made under the new rule. This rule strengthens protections for borrowers from fraud and applies the same accountability metrics to all institutions across the board. The rule provides due process for students and institutions, but rightfully gives students the last word. The rule keeps the standard of evidence the same as the one used by the Obama administration, by the way. And thanks to stakeholder feedback, the rule does not require borrowers to prove intent. Another point, this new rule will only apply to new claims for loans taken out after July 1st. And I do want to thank Secretary DeVos and all of the hard-working individuals at the Department of Education for working through the caseload under the Obama standard. Your hard work of processing more than 5,000 cases per week for borrowers seeking relief has not gone unnoticed. A vote against this veto override is a vote in favor of creating a system that is fair for students and taxpayers. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution. I yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from North Carolina, the chair of the Workforce Protection Subcommittee, and also chair of the HBCU caucus, Ms. Adams.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this measure to override the president's veto and to stand up for our nation's 20 million college students. Secretary DeVos's rule would harm tens of thousands of college students and would allow bad actors to continue some of the worst practices, such as forcing students to sign pre-arbitration agreements that limit their rights. We cannot allow predatory institutions to steal the dream of a college degree from any child. It's shameful that in his veto message, President Trump used historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, as cover for his pro-fraud, anti-student agenda. Now let's be clear, no HBCU has ever been implicated in a borrower defense claim, and no HBCU has voiced support for Secretary DeVos's rule. That's fake news. It is time that President Trump and Secretary DeVos begin standing up for North Carolinians seeking opportunity instead of laying down to our nation's worst institutions. And if they won't do it, Congress will. It's a fundamental right. Du Bois told us of all of the civil rights for which the world has struggled and fought for, the right to learn is the most fundamental. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Byrne.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
I thank the gentlewoman from North Carolina for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to overriding President Trump's veto of H.J. Res. 76. Everyone in this chamber can agree that schools that commit fraud and take advantage of students must be held accountable. However, returning to the 2016 borrower defense rule put in place by the Obama administration is not the answer. Put simply, the Obama-era rule sends millions of taxpayer dollars to those who were not harmed by their university. Under the Obama-era rule, the standard to define fraud was placed so low that the Department of Education saw about 300,000 relief applications in just 5 years. Compare that to the just 59 applications in the previous 20 years the borrower defense process has been in place. Understanding this problem, the Trump administration released an updated borrower defense rule in 2019 to prevent fraud, ensure taxpayer dollars are spent responsibly, and cut the regulatory red tape that has made it difficult for students and educational institutions to understand the old rule. The new rule also ensures that due process, a founding principle of our nation, is in place for both students and institutions. The cost of allowing the Obama rule to stand is great, over $40 billion, 40 billion taxpayer dollars. Thankfully, the changes made by the Trump administration will save taxpayers billions while still ensuring that students are protected from fraud. The Trump administration rule applies relief where it is needed, unlike the overly broad Obama-era rule. This should be something both parties can support. Mr. Speaker, there is no doubt that students who are defrauded by education institutions deserve debt relief, but the Obama-era rule is not the answer. I urge my colleagues to vote no and sustain the President's veto, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Washington, distinguished member of the Committee on Education and Labor, Ms. Jayapal.
The gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The American people do not support Betsy DeVos. We don't support her radical attempts to privatize education. We don't support her corrupt efforts to take coronavirus relief away from public schools so that it can be sent to private ones. We don't support her hateful transphobic agenda or attacks on survivors of sexual assault. And we do not support her putting predatory for-profit colleges over those who they cheated with a rule that would force the most vulnerable students who were robbed to repay 97% of what they borrowed. That's why Congress passed H.J. Res. 76 with bipartisan support. But just as Vice President Pence had to save Betsy DeVos's Senate confirmation, President Trump is trying to save her dangerous rule against our bipartisan bill. So I urge my colleagues to override this veto. And once again, let's make clear that the People's House stands on the side of the people and not Betsy DeVos. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Watkins.
The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to the costly resolution that would allow more fraud, waste, and abuse. No one condones fraud, especially when it's perpetrated by an institute of higher learning. Every student who's financially defrauded is entitled to relief and forgiveness, period. But we should make sure that we're helping those who have been defrauded. It's our job to do due diligence for the American taxpayer. The Trump administration has made this a priority. Unlike the Obama administration, they used forgiveness. They used the rule to forgive as many student loans as they could. They'd even target institutions they didn't like. That's partisan, it's costly to the taxpayer, and it's harmful to the student. And that's why I support Secretary DeVos and President Trump. Their borrower's defense rule takes taxpayers into account. After seeing the enormous price tag of $42 billion that the Obama rule created, President Trump and Secretary DeVos acted swiftly to take that burden off of the back of the taxpayers. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Madam Secretary. And I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the Gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, distinguished member of the Committee on Education and Labor, Ms. Wild.
Gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of House Joint Resolution 76. Students defrauded by predatory for-profit colleges can be left with crushing debt, useless degrees, and none of the job opportunities they were promised. Secretary DeVos could provide immediate relief to students who were defrauded. Instead, she has halted student loan relief and written a new rule under which defrauded borrowers could be denied debt relief even when predatory colleges clearly violated the law. Earlier this year, bipartisan majorities in the House and the Senate voted together to reject that rule. But President Trump has vetoed our legislation, yet another of his actions that will hurt students and taxpayers. More than 7,000 Pennsylvanians are suffering while their applications for financial relief are sitting in limbo at the Department of Education. If Congress does not override the president's veto, student borrowers will be harmed and predatory colleges will receive another giveaway. I am proud to stand with students and to vote to override the president's veto of House Joint Resolution 76. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise today yet again to urge my colleagues to vote no on today's vote to override the president's veto of House Joint Resolution 76. It is unconscionable that any institution of higher education would engage in fraudulent misrepresentation to prey on student loan borrowers, particularly veterans who are able to qualify for GI benefits to attend schools. President Trump's common sense rule would help students who were defrauded and suffer financial harm by any school to give them the opportunity to individually make their case, ensuring due process for all parties. It would also save taxpayers $11 billion compared to President Obama's last-minute one-size-fits-all rule that did not hold schools accountable. As a member of the Education and Labor Committee and the former chairman of Higher Education Subcommittee, I strongly urge my colleagues to vote no today. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, distinguished member of the Committee on Education and Labor, Mr. Harder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to encourage my colleagues to vote to protect my constituents who were scammed by for-profit colleges. Both the House and the Senate took bipartisan votes to protect these students, but the President overruled our votes, siding with Secretary DeVos and her billionaire donors. This issue hits home for me. I met a woman named Artemisa who attended a corrupt college in my district. She studied to be a nurse and graduated with $40,000 in debt, but no one would hire her. She's still paying off that debt to this day. And it's not just Artemisa. Thousands of students at scam colleges across the country have similar stories. And if Secretary DeVos's new plan isn't stopped, these student borrowers may never get the justice they deserve. That's not what we do in this country. If Secretary DeVos is concerned about cost, she should talk to her billionaire friends in the corrupt college industry. The criminals should not be putting the financial burden on the victims of this fraud. I encourage everyone to vote to overturn the president's veto. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We'll reserve.
Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, the chair of the Committee on Financial Services, Ms. Waters.
The chairwoman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman Scott, for yielding 2 minutes to me on this important issue. I rise to override the President's veto of H.J. Res. 76, which undoes a Secretary DeVos rule that would make it nearly impossible for veterans and student borrowers defrauded by their schools to obtain financial relief. Congress voted on a bipartisan basis to reject Secretary DeVos's borrower defense rule, which only cancels 3% of the student loans resulting from school misconduct. keeping 97% of our veterans and student borrowers drowning in debts they only incurred due to fraud from which they may never recover. If Secretary DeVos's efforts to prioritize profit over education are allowed to stand, then the for-profit industry will continue to do what it always has: exploit veterans, student borrowers, and those trying to better their lives and support their families by obtaining an education. This is a fight with which I'm deeply familiar. This Congress, the House Financial Services Committee, held 2 hearings examining the student loan crisis and approved 3 bills that will provide strong student and borrower protections, including for those harmed by for-profit colleges. And during the COVID-19 crisis, I have fought to provide up to $10,000 of relief for private student loan borrowers and continue to fight to protect student loan borrowers who should not have to deal with debt collections, negative credit reportings, late fees, and penalties while dealing with this pandemic. With over 200,000 pending borrower defense applications for loan relief, these students desperately need and deserve our help. So I urge my colleagues to support veterans and student borrowers by overriding the President's veto of H.J. Res. 76. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll continue to reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, the chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health, and Human Services, Ms. DeLauro.
The gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to support this override. Predatory for-profit colleges scammed students and taxpayers out of millions of dollars. Predatory for-profit colleges account for 9% of students in post-secondary education, but 33% of defaults. To help students, the Department of Education, under the Obama administration, created a streamlined resolution process under the Borrower Defense to Repayment provision of the Higher Education Act. Now Secretary DeVos is breaking the process. I will tell you what her goal is. It's to aid the perpetrators, not to help the victims. Under her new rule, borrowers lose out. They lose out if they cannot prove the school intentionally defrauded them, if they cannot file their claim fast enough, or if they cannot document their exact financial harm. As a result, as little as 3% of eligible debt will be forgiven now. And what little relief there is now will likely be shouldered by taxpayers, not the schools committing the fraud. Stopping the secretary, as we are pushing to do, has wide support. 20 state attorney generals, nearly 60 advocacy groups for students, civil rights, and education. The American Legion has said, and I quote, "Deception against our veterans and service members has been a lucrative scam for unscrupulous actors." And so I say to my Republican colleagues who want to support the military, support this override. And to those of us who want to fight for racial and economic justice, support this override. In 2018, we wrote to the Secretary, alarmed about how this rule could hurt students of color. And I quote, 95% of black students attending a for-profit college took out student loans, and a staggering 75% of black students who did not complete their program defaulted. We must act now for veterans, for students of color, for borrowers across this country. In Connecticut, 1,100 defrauded students are waiting to be made whole. They need this override, not that cruel policy. Vote to override, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
We'll continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, before I yield to the gentleman from Rhode Island, I'd just like to remind our colleagues that just yesterday, a federal court ruled that the Department of Education must provide full relief for 7,200 defrauded Massachusetts student borrowers who attended Corinthian College. Unfortunately, there are still borrowers around the country still waiting for relief. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Rhode Island, member of the House Judiciary Committee, Mr. Cicilline.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the resolution to override the president's veto. In 2016, the Obama administration issued the borrower defense rule in order to provide relief to student borrowers defrauded by predatory for-profit institutions, which promised an education and credentials to pursue a career, only to find these credentials did not have the value they were promised. In the aftermath of the collapse of institutions like Corinthian College and ITT Technical Institute, the Obama administration sought to provide relief to those students left out in the cold. The borrower defense rule provided a path to relief to those students who sought to receive an education but were instead left with nothing but debt and few paths forward. Sadly and predictably, the Trump administration ended these protections and implemented a rule making it harder to obtain relief, siding with predatory for-profit institutions rather than the victims, the students and veterans of these wrongdoers. According to the Institute for College Access and Success, the number of students eligible to seek debt relief or loan forgiveness will drop from 53% of borrowers under the Obama-era rule to just 3% under the Trump rule. In response, Congress, in a bipartisan way, came together to reject the administration's rule change and rejecting their efforts to leave defrauded students out in the cold. The president vetoed this relief. Now Congress must once again stand on the side of those who sought to obtain a higher education and provide a better life for themselves and their families. I urge adoption of the override resolution, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
I will continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlewoman reserved. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, a member of the Financial Services and Oversight Committees, Ms. Porter.
Thank you. Under the Higher Education Act, students who are defrauded by private predatory colleges are entitled to relief on their loans. The prior administration created a streamlined process to help defrauded borrowers access relief and move forward with their lives. Secretary DeVos tried to strip those protections away, but we fought back. Some of my Republican colleagues in the House and Senate voted with us to overturn Secretary Betsy DeVos's new rule. We came together to defend students and to stand up against fraud, waste, and abuse. But President Trump vetoed this important resolution. Instead of standing with students and taxpayers, President Trump stood with corrupt private colleges and Secretary DeVos. So today, I ask my Republican friends, do you want to stand with our country's students, with the future of our workforce and our communities, or do you want to betray them to please the president? I think the choice is clear, and I hope you do too. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will continue to reserve.
Gentlewoman reserved. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you advise how much time is remaining on each side?
The gentleman from Virginia has 9 minutes remaining. The gentlewoman from North Carolina has 7 minutes remaining.
You said 7?
7 minutes for the gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you. This time, Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Finkenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this resolution and overriding the president's veto. I want to talk about two Iowans who tried taking a step forward, but were knocked 2 steps back by a for-profit school looking for an easy buck and taking advantage of the hopes and dreams of my constituents. Julie, a mother from Iowa, was looking to boost her career, and Jeff, an Army reservist and construction manager, was trying to continue his education. They bought into ITT Tech's promises, worked hard for new career opportunities, and took out loans to do it. Both had their lives turned upside down when ITT Tech suddenly closed. A 2016 federal rule forgave loans for folks like Julie and Jeff, who were obviously taken advantage of. Unfortunately, this administration decided to roll back the common sense rule, weakening protections for borrowers. In our state, there are more than 1,000 borrowers who were taken advantage of and still waiting for their case to be resolved. We must stand with them and override the president's veto of this resolution. Thank you. And I yield back.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
I'll reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Michigan, a member of the Financial Services Committee and Oversight and Reform Committee, Ms. Lieb.
Gentlewoman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. In January of this year, I stood here to speak against this administration's continued attack on our students. 5 months later, Secretary DeVos, with the support of this administration, continues to work on behalf of predatory for-profit institutions rather than the students they lied to, that they scammed. Instead of ensuring that students who were cheated out of their future by these fraudulent institutions, Secretary DeVos is fighting to ensure that these institutions are never held accountable. Both Democratic and Republican members alike agreed that if you were defrauded by one of these colleges, then your federal student loan should be forgiven. We must stop this administration's relentless efforts to protect the pockets of predatory corporations at the expense of our students. I'm proud to support this veto override. Thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time. I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman's prepared to close. Gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're prepared to close also.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of my time. Mr. Speaker, contrary to the Democrats' claims we've heard today, the Trump administration and Republicans in the House are committed to providing relief to students who have been truly harmed by fraudulent practices. The Obama administration's borrower defense rule, though, was extremely difficult to administer. It left students and institutions confused, encouraged massive and unnecessary loan forgiveness, and created a hefty bill for taxpayers. And anyone who believes it was a streamlined process, I will show you some swampland in New Mexico. President Trump acted quickly to protect borrowers and taxpayers better. The 2019 Borrower Defense Rule clarified standards and made a process more accessible. If Democrats overturn the president's veto, we will be left with the convoluted Obama rule. And under the rules associated with today's legislation, there can be no revisions made even to improve or clarify the Obama rule. We want all schools to serve students well. In particular, we want veterans and their education benefits protected, and in this administration, they will be. Mr. Speaker, I've worked hard all my life to help people get a good education and have a better life. I would not be supporting the overturn of this rule if that was not the direction in which we were going. The Education Department's Borrower Defense Rule protects all student borrowers, including veterans, holds higher education institutions accountable, and saves taxpayers $11 billion. Unfortunately, Democrats will stop at nothing to tear down meaningful reforms ushered in under President Trump's leadership, even if it comes at the expense of our nation's students. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of the time. Mr. Speaker, we've heard a lot about $11 billion. Let me tell you exactly what that is. That's $11 billion that students who have been defrauded will now have to pay if this resolution fails. According to the flawed formula from the Department of Education, even those that can prove fraud can expect relief on average to go from about 50% of their debt to down to 3% of their debt, and many, because of that formula, will get absolutely nothing. Mr. Speaker, now is the time that we have a choice. We can give relief to students, especially veterans who have been defrauded by predatory colleges, or make them pay student loans even though they received a worthless educational experience. I urge my colleagues to side with the students and vote yes on this resolution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is, will the House, on reconsideration, pass the joint resolution, the objections of the President to the contrary notwithstanding? Under the Constitution, the vote must be by the yeas and nays. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Gentleman from Virginia, seek recognition.
As a member designated by Mr. Lowenthal pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Mr. Lowenthal will vote yea on the veto override for H.J. Res. 76. And as the member designated by Mr. Liu of California pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Mr. Liu will vote yea on the veto override for House Joint Resolution 76. As the member designated by Ms. Moore of Wisconsin pursuant to House Resolution 965, inform the House that Ms. Moore will vote yea on the veto override for House Joint Resolution 76.
Well done.
purpose does the gentleman from the great state of Michigan seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Mr. Lewis of Georgia pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Lewis will vote aye on the veto override for H.J. Res. 76.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Mr. Lipinski pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Lipinski will vote yea on the veto override for H.J. Res. 76. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Ms. Lofgren pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House Ms. Lofgren will vote yea on the veto override of House H.J. Res. 76. As the member designated by Mr. Garamendi pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Garamendi will vote yes.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from the state of New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mrs. Lowy pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mrs. Lowy will vote yea on the veto override for H.J. Res. 76. As the member designated by Mr. Serrano pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Serrano will vote yea on the veto override for H.J. Res. 76.
For what purpose does the gentleman from the state of Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Lawson of Florida, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Mr. Lawson will vote yea.
Gentleman from the state of Arizona seek recognition.
As a member designated by Representative Kirkpatrick, pursuant to H.R. 965, I inform the House that Representative Kirkpatrick will vote aye on the veto override for H.J. Resolution 76.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from the great state of Connecticut seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Wilson pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Ms. Wilson of Florida will vote yea on the veto override to H.J. Res. 76.
It's Wilson. If the gentleman from Connecticut would again state her request.
As the member designated by Ms. Wilson pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Ms. Wilson of Florida will vote aye on the veto override for H.J. Res. 76.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from the state of California seek recognition?
As a member designated by Mr. DeSaulnier of California pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. DeSaulnier will vote yea on the veto override for H.J. Res. 76.
For what purpose does the gentleman from the state of California seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Cardenas pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Cardenas will vote aye on the veto override of H.J. Res. 76. As the member designated by Mr. Khanna pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Khanna will vote aye on the veto override of H.J. Res. 76.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from the state of New York seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Deutsch of Florida pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Deutsch will vote yea on overriding President Trump's veto of H.J. Res. 76.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from the state of California seek recognition?
Okay. As the member designated by Ms. Sanchez pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Ms. Sanchez will vote aye on the veto override for H.J. Resolution 76.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from the state of New Hampshire seek recognition?
As the member designated by Representative Horace Frankel pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Ms. Frankel will vote yea on the veto override for H.J. Res. 76. As the member designated by Representative Shelley Pingree pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Ms. Pingree will vote yea on the veto override for H.J. Res. 76.
For what purpose does the distinguished chair of the Rules Committee, the gentleman from the state of Massachusetts, seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Welsh of Vermont pursuant to H.Res. 965, I will inform the House that Mr. Welsh will vote aye
on the veto override for H.J. Res. 76.
For what purpose does the prestigious chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, the gentleman from the state of New Jersey, seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Ms. Bonnie Watson Coleman, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Ms. Watson Coleman will vote aye on the veto override.
The prestigious chairman.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from the state of Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Spear, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Ms. Spear will vote yea on the veto override for HJ Resolution 76.
Does the gentleman from the state of California seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As member designated by Congressmember Grace Napolitano, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Congressmember Napolitano would vote aye on the veto override of House Resolution SJ Res 76. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from the state of Massachusetts seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by the Honorable James Langevin, the gentleman from Rhode Island, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Mr. Langevin will vote yes on overriding President Trump's veto of House Resolution 76. Thank you.
For what purpose does the distinguished chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, the gentleman from Brooklyn, seek recognition?
Thank the distinguished gentleman from Colorado. As the member designated by Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Chairwoman Johnson will vote aye on the veto override for H.J. Res. 76.
Figured I got it. For what purpose does the gentleman from the state of Maryland seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Ms. Axney of Iowa, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Ms. Axney will vote aye on the veto override for House Resolution 76.
Woman from Florida. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Payne of New Jersey pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Payne will vote yea on the veto override for H.J. Res. 76.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from the state of Nevada seek recognition?
Thank you. As the member designated by Mr. Engel, pursuant to House Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Engel will vote yea on the veto override for H.J. Res. 76.
On this vote, the yeas are 238 and the nays are 173. Two-thirds not being in the affirmative, the veto of the President is sustained and the joint resolution is rejected. The veto message and the joint resolution are referred to the Committee on Education and Labor. The clerk will notify the Senate of the action of the House. There you go.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the question on agreeing to the motion to recommit on H.R. 51 offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Keller, on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will redesignate the motion.
Motion to recommit on H.R. 51 offered by Mr. Keller of Pennsylvania.
The question is on agreeing to the motion to recommit. Members will record their votes by electronic device. That's right. We got over there. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Lofgren pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Ms. Lofgren will vote nay on the motion to recommit. As the member designated by Mr. Garamendi pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Garamendi will vote no on the motion to recommit.
Does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Khanna pursuant to H-Res 965, I inform the House that Mr. Khanna will vote nay on the motion to recommit. As the member designated by Mr. Cardenas pursuant to H-Res 965, I inform the House that Mr. Cardenas will vote nay on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Ms. Axney of Iowa, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Ms. Axney will be voting nay on the motion to recommit. She'll be voting nay.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Moore, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Ms. Moore will vote nay on the motion to recommit. And as the member designated by Mr. Liu, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Mr. Liu will vote nay on the motion to recommit. And as the member designated by Mr. Lowenthal, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Mr. Lowenthal will vote nay on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Mr. Lipinski, pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Lipinski will vote nay on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Connecticut seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Wilson, pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Ms. Wilson of Florida will vote no on the motion to recommit.
What purpose does the gentlewoman from New York rise?
As a member designated by Mrs. Lowy pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mrs. Lowy will vote nay on the motion to recommit. As the member designated by Mr. Serrano pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Serrano will vote nay on the motion to recommit.
what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Lawson of Florida, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Mr. Lawson votes nay.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
As a member designated by Ms. Sanchez pursuant to H Resolution 965, I inform the House that Ms. Sanchez will vote nay on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by the Honorable James Langevin of Rhode Island pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Mr. Langevin will vote no on the motion to recommit of H.R. 51. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as member designated by Congressmember Grace Napolitano, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Congressmember Napolitano will be voting nay on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Lewis of Georgia, pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Lewis will vote nay on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
As a member designated by Mr. Welsh of Vermont, pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Welsh will vote nay on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
As the member designated by Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Chairwoman Johnson will vote nay on the motion to recommit.
Does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
As a member designated by Representative Kirkpatrick, pursuant to H.R. 965, I inform the House that Representative Kirkpatrick will vote nay on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. DeSaulnier, pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. DeSaulnier will vote nay on the motion to recommit.
Does the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
as the member designated by Ms. Spear pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Ms. Spear will vote nay on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Payne of New Jersey pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Payne will vote nay on the motion to recommit. How you doing?
Nevada, right? For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Nevada seek recognition?
As a member designated by Mr. Engel pursuant to House Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Engel will vote no on the motion to recommit.
New Hampshire seek recognition?
As the member designated by Representative Lois Frankel pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Ms. Frankel will vote nay on the motion to recommit. As the member designated by Representative Shelley Pingree pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Ms. Pingree will vote nay on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Deutsch of Florida pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Deutsch will vote nay on the motion to recommit.
Purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Ms. Bonnie Watson Coleman pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Ms. Watson Coleman will vote no.
This vote, the yeas are 182 and the nays are 227. The motion is not adopted. The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker,
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia
requesting
seek
yeas and
recognition?
nays.
Pursuant to Section 3 of House Resolution 965, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Axney of Iowa pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Ms. Axney will vote aye on H.R. 51, the Washington, D.C. Admission Act.
Gentlewoman from New York seek recognition.
Nominated by Mr. Deutsch of Florida pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Deutsch will vote yea on H.R. 51.
Does the gentlewoman from New Hampshire seek recognition?
1 second. As the member designated by Representative Lois Frankel pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Ms. Frankel will vote yea on H.R. 51. As the member designated by Representative Shelley Pingree pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Ms. Pingree will vote yea on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Lawson of Florida, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Mr. Lawson will vote yes.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Spear pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Ms. Spear will vote yea on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Congressmember Grace Napolitano, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Congressmember Napolitano will vote yea on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by the Honorable James Langevin of Rhode Island, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I'd like to inform the House that Mr. Langevin will vote yes on final passage of H.R. 51. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Bonnie Watson Coleman pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Ms. Watson Coleman will vote aye.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Lewis of Georgia, pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Lewis will vote aye on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
As a member designated by Ms. Sanchez pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Ms. Sanchez will vote aye on H.R. 51.
I was going to say. Does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Liu of California, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Mr. Liu will vote yea on H.R. 51. And as the member designated by Ms. Moore of Wisconsin, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Ms. Moore will vote yea on H.R. 51. And as the member designated by Mr. Lowenthal of California, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Mr. Lowenthal will vote yea on H.R. 51.
The Vice Speaker of the House is voting. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Payne of New Jersey, pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Payne will vote yea on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Carnes pursuant to H.Res. 965, I will inform the House that Mr. Carnes will vote aye on H.R. 51. As the member designated by Mr. Khanna pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Khanna will vote aye on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
As the member designated by Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Chairwoman Johnson will vote aye on H.R. 51.
Does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Mr. Lipinski pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Lipinski will vote yea on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. DeSaulnier pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. DeSaulnier will vote yea on H.R. 51.
We were doing such blue ribbon work, and then it
Okay. For what purposes does the gentlewoman from New York rise?
As the member designated by Mrs. Lowy pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mrs. Lowy will vote yea on H.R. 51. As the member designated by Mr. Serrano pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Serrano will vote yea on H.R. 51.
Yeah. What purpose does the gentleman from New Mexico rise?
I'm not
For
from
what
New Mexico.
purposes does the gentleman rise?
As the member
From
designated,
Arizona.
as the member designated by Representative Kirkpatrick pursuant to H.R. 965, I inform the House that Representative Kirkpatrick will vote aye on H.R. 51.
For what purposes does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Ms. Lofgren of California pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Ms. Lofgren will vote yea on H.R. 51. As the member designated by Mr. Garamendi of California pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Mr. Garamendi will vote yea on H.R. 51.
Rise.
Member designated by Mr. Welsh of Vermont, pursuant to H.Res. 965, I will inform the House that Mr. Welsh will vote aye on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut rise?
As the member designated by Ms. Wilson, pursuant to H.Res. 965, I inform the House that Ms. Wilson of Florida will vote yea on H.R. 51.
Do we have? Purposes does the gentlewoman from Nevada rise?
Thank you. As the member designated by Mr. Engel, pursuant to House Resolution 965, I inform the House that Mr. Engel will vote yes on H.R. 51.
32 votes. Members voted. There being 232 votes in the affirmative, 180 votes in the negative, the District of Columbia Statehood Bill, H.R. 51, is passed without objection. Motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Does the gentlewoman from California rise?
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to take from the Speaker's table Senate Concurrent Resolution 38 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
Senate Concurrent Resolution 38, concurrent resolution to establish the Joint Congressional Committee on Inaugural Ceremonies for the inauguration of the President-elect and Vice President-elect of the United States on January 20th, 2021.
Is there objection to the consideration of the concurrent resolution? Without objection, the concurrent resolution is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess for a period less than 15 minutes.